Well, I was asked to show evidence that Mycobacterium paratuberculosis is not implicated, in Crohn's disease. You'll forgive me that I'm going to call it Mycobacterium paratuberculosis rather than MAP, or Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis. So I hope you don't mind that. What I'm showing you here, because I'm a pathologist, I'm going to speak from the point of view of a pathologist and somebody who's looked at the mechanisms of disease and the lesions of disease that occur in patients. If you see here, if you look here, you'll see that this is a granuloma. It's got multinucleate giant cells, it's got lots of lymphocytes, it's got a little bit of a whirling appearance to it. This is the similarity between Johne's disease and Crohn's disease. If you take your microscope and you turn it down to where you're using the 40x, and you look and you find one granuloma, that's where it's similar. And I have shown people granulomas from Johne's disease and said to them, look, this looks just like Crohn's disease, and vice versa. However, if you go beyond that, there are an awful lot of variations, an awful lot of features of Crohn's disease. And I have published this. I published this in 1999. And I had to debate with myself whether it was fair to reiterate for you something that was published and something that I've spoken about in other places. But then I thought probably there were half the members of the audience that hadn't read this paper or hadn't heard me speak about these lesions before. I'm not going to go through every article here, every feature that occurs in Crohn's disease that doesn't occur in Johne's disease. In the bottom half, you see what are called the extraintestinal manifestations. And so it's okay, we could say, well, sheep and goats and cattle and deer would not be expected to have the same extraintestinal features. But I want to call to your attention that in Crohn's disease is much more severe than Johne's disease is. Most of the cases of Johne's disease that we see in our place, they've just lost some weight. They've lost some condition. But in Crohn's disease, there are fissures that go through the wall. You can think of them as vertical ulcers instead of horizontal ones. There are fistulas that go to other parts of the body, to the bladder, to the thigh muscles, to the umbilicus. There are abscesses that form in the wall or adjacent to the wall in the serosa and subserosa. There is obstruction. Patients are always being operated upon for obstruction. Can anyone here tell me the last time they heard of a Johne's case being operated upon for obstruction? And of course there's dilatation above that. There's perforation. There are loop-to-loop adhesions that occur from this localized peritonitis. So the first point that I want to make this evening is that there are many, many features of Crohn's disease that just don't match up to Johne's disease. And I get offended personally when people start their paper with, there are many similarities between Johne's disease and Crohn's disease, because those people have not seen the two diseases side by side as I have. In addition, I think the lesion is in the submucosa. And I have recently written papers about the lymphangitis that is so characteristic of Crohn's disease. Some of you can look and you can talk to your pathology friend and ask them the last time they saw a lesion like this in Johne's disease. These are lymphatics that are filled with inflammatory cells. There's a small granuloma getting started here, and there are multiple lymphocytes. This is a perilymphangitis. And most of this is taking place in the submucosa of the patient and not in the mucosa. So when we talk about studies in which these little snippets are taken from the mucosa, one could ask, are they really sampling where the damage is? Are they really sampling the appropriate part, which in my opinion is the submucosa and not the mucosa. Now what I'd like to do is, I'm not going to focus on any one. I want to talk to you about some of the bacteriologic culture work, some of the serology, some of the immunohistochemistry, some of the PCR. I hope I have enough time to get through some of these PCR papers and tell you a slant that I have on them, the criticism that I have, the way that I interpreted that might not be obvious after you read the paper. This recrudescence of interest in Mycobacterium paratuberculosis began in my laboratory with Dr. Giordini in 1982, when we first reported the recovery of an organism that was named Linda, and then subsequently Dominique and Benjamin and Leona were isolated. So over a period of several years, in several different papers, Dr. Giordini and co-workers described these 4 organisms. And then there were different labs here and there that were trying to recover this organism. They would in fact write and try to get our methods, which weren't terribly complex. All you had to do was use Mycobacterium J in Harold's egg yolk medium. But for a long time it was said there were only 10 cultures of Mycobacterium paratuberculosis that had been recovered. And that persisted for about 27 years. Now, I want to jump back in history. Though I've told you what Giordini had done, a lot of people are not aware of the work that was done by Dr. Bill Van Patter, who did a thesis here at the University of Minnesota. He worked his tail off, I can tell you. You should see that thesis. Of course, you aren't going to find it listed in PubMed. You'd have to go to your librarian and say, go get me the Van Patter thesis of 1952. He describes in great detail the 43 patients that he studied. So the first part is the pathology. And then he went to a laboratory, a veterinary laboratory, where they were skilled at recovering Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. And he learned how to do that. And he went back and he got 7 different culture media. And he incubated those 7 different culture media. They were doing 1,762 attempts on these 43 patients for up to 5 months, and they were all negative for Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. I think you have to look at how diligently that work was done and that he was unable to recover Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. And we know, if we've been following the literature, that Mike Collins got the idea to try again in 2000. And he had a lot of culture attempts, almost 4,000 culture attempts with various selected media on 191 patients, 79 of whom had Crohn's disease, and these all turned out to be negative for Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. So we haven't had good luck recovering that organism from the tissues of patients that have Crohn's disease. And then some things changed, and we've had a new wave of interest and activity and concern, in fact, because NASA, working in Florida, reports that he can find Mycobacterium paratuberculosis, in fact, isolated from the milk of CD patients, 2 patients, 2 out of 2, and not in 5 controls. That raises some serious issues and questions about technique, if not anything else. Tim Bull also changed the format of what we call a positive culture, because there was this idea then that, well, they don't grow very well in the usual media, but let's grow them up in selective media, these midget media, the Mycobacterium growth indicator 2 cultures, and let's detect them by PCR for IS-900. So now, we're not saying that we grew them anymore. We're saying, well, we demonstrated them by finding the IS-900 in the culture after several weeks or after several months. But he admits in that paper, he and his co-authors, by the way, I'm only going to mention the first authors, and I apologize if I leave out some of the co-authors, but for the sake of time and efficiency, I haven't done that. But he then acknowledges, however, the isolation from these positive midget cultures on solid, medium, or in extended culture has not yet been achieved. So are these real positives, or are they not real positives? Then Nasser makes it a little bit worse. in that he describes the isolation of viable organisms